Okay, let's begin. First, for those of you who did not get a syllabus last time, there are some extra copies up here you can pick up at the end of class. Also, there's a copy of the syllabus posted on the course website on BSpace. A couple of other announcements. First, for waitlisted students who are not enrolled in the course but who want to be, you're on the wait list. If you're not on the wait list and you want to be in the course, get on a wait list, because the way through into the course is through discussion sections. So what really matters is not your number on the wait list for the course. What matters is your number on the wait list for a discussion section, okay, which is a lower number, okay? Not a perfect number necessarily, but at least a lower number. So what you should do, there are no discussion sections this week, remember, but what you should do beginning next week, next Tuesday, is go to the discussion section for which you're waitlisted. If there's room in the class, the GSI who's running that discussion section will let you in. A couple of you have asked if you could switch discussion sections. The answer is generally yes, but do not try to do that through telebears. If you try to switch discussions through telebears will drop you from the course and put you on the bottom of the waiting list, which is not a good place to be, okay? So, but we'll do that switching of discussion sections informally beginning next week. So don't try to deal with that now, okay? So that's that. The other announcement is to remind you that there are lecture notes available for this course through the Black Lightning lecture service. It's a professional note-taking service. It's the only authorized note-taking service on campus, run basically by students, for students, usually pretty good. And the cost this semester, if I remember correctly, is $29. You can order these things online on the Black Lightning lecture notes the website, and they take all available credit cards, I believe, and everything's delivered to you over the web. It's very, very, very nice. The last announcement concerns the pre-screening survey for the research participation program. Just a reminder that if you want to do that, and I suggest you do it, it's the easiest way to earn an RPP credit, and it makes you eligible for certain other experiments. That is due this Friday. You need to complete that this Friday if you're going to complete the pre-screening. Some of you encountered a small glitch in the pre-screening. You wanted to do some and then sign off and then come back later, and you found yourself essentially kicked off. That glitch has been fixed. If you were kicked off before, you can sign back on and finish the pre-screening. Anything else I should announce? That's it? Okay. At the end of the 19th century, writing what is probably one of the first and now still the greatest textbook of psychology, the American philosopher and psychologist William James famously defined psychology as the science of mental life, the science that tries to understand the cognitive and emotional and motivational processes that underlie human experience, thought, and action. So the psychology is a science of mental life. But because the physical basis of mental life is to be found in the brain and other structures of the nervous system and other biological structures for that matter, we begin the course by examining something about the biological foundations of our mental lives in the brain and the rest of the nervous system. Now, just to review a little bit of high school biology here, the nervous system is a biological system, biological structure, and like all biological structures, it's organized hierarchically. At the lowest level of the organization of the nervous system, or any, for that matter, any biological organization is the cell, which you'll remember is defined as the smallest biological unit that can function independently. Then we group together cells of a particular kind to make tissues, and then groups of tissues that perform a particular function come together to form organs. Then we have systems, which are groups of organs that perform related functions, and then we have an organism, the living individual, composed of a whole bunch of interrelated, interdependent systems. And then you can talk about groups of organisms, species and genuses and families and all that kind of stuff. In psychology, we tend to focus on this level of analysis. The point is that the nervous system is just one system in the body that allows various organs to influence and communicate with each other. And again, at each level of the hierarchical organization of a biological structure, there is a particular level in the neuron. At the cell level, the nervous system has a bunch of neurons, like billions and billions of neurons that are grouped together at the tissue level to comprise nerves and ganglia and nuclei. I'll define these in a couple of minutes. Then there are a bunch of tissues that are grouped together at the organ level to comprise the brain, the spinal cord, and the brain stem, which basically connects the brain and the spinal cord. Then we have, at the system level, the nervous system, which itself can be broken down into a central nervous system consisting of the brain and the spinal cord, and a peripheral nervous system, which consists of all the nerves that run to and from the central nervous system. So neurons become nerves, nerves become neural organs grouped into various kinds of nervous systems, all part of the living individual. Okay, so the basic unit of the nervous system is the neuron. Okay, so what a neuron looks like: there's a cell body here with a nucleus. There are some dendrites that fan off the cell body. There is a long axon, and then there are terminal fibers. Make a long story short, electrical impulses arise in the cell body, move down the axon to terminal endings, where there is a process that triggers a similar process in the next neuron over. That process of neural transmission is described very nicely in your textbook in Gleitman in Chapter 2, and I'm not going to go over it here. If you want some extra perspective on it, you'll find it in the lecture supplement. What I want to do is to focus on the structural aspects of the nervous system for now, because it turns out that these neurons come in three basic types. There are sensory or afferent neurons, efferent neurons, and interneurons. Afferent neurons convey sensory impulses, the kinds of neural impulses that are involved in sensory function, hearing, touching, seeing, all of that business. Those messages are carried by afferent neurons, whereas motor impulses, where you're taking action with respect to the outside world, those are carried by efferent neurons. If you need a mnemonic here, efferent, you have an effect on something. Your motor behavior has an effect on something, so it's efferent with an E. Afferent, affect, like feeling. If you're feeling something, you're feeling it by virtue of afferent neurons. And then there are interneurons, which basically connect afferent and efferent neurons. Afferent and efferent neurons comprise the peripheral nervous system, about which I'll say more in a minute. Interneurons tend to comprise the central nervous system, about which I'll say quite a bit the next time we meet. These three different kinds of neurons, afferent, efferent, and interneurons, come together to comprise the minimum functioning unit in the nervous system, the minimum functioning unit, which is known as the reflex arc, which consists of an afferent neuron conveying a sensory impulse in, an interneuron connecting to an efferent neuron, and an efferent neuron carrying a message out to respond to the stimulus. Stimulus, processing, response, the basic functioning unit of the nervous system. And since roughly the time of Descartes, this has been known as the reflex arc, and it's a system that basically mediates the organism's motor responses to stimulation. Now, that's the minimum functioning unit in the nervous system. In fact, we have larger units that are really more important, that are composed of various kinds of neurons. We have first in the peripheral nervous system tissues known as nerves, which come in two kinds, afferent nerves and efferent nerves, because they're composed of afferent neurons, sensory neurons, and efferent neurons, motor neurons. Then we have ganglia, which are bunches of interneurons, okay? And ganglia and nuclei are both bunches of interneurons, but as a rule, ganglia are found outside the brain and the spinal cord. Nuclei are found inside the brain and the spinal cord. I think I'm going to show you some of that the next time. But in any event, again, this is how the structure of the nervous system is basically arranged. Okay, neurons come in three kinds: afferent sensory neurons, efferent motor neurons, and interneurons that connect them. Groups of related neurons are organized at the next higher level into nerves and ganglia and nuclei. Two kinds of nerves, depending on whether they're comprised of afferent neurons or efferent neurons. Two kinds of ganglia, depending on whether they're located outside the central nervous system or inside the central nervous system. At the next, yes? Nuclei and ganglia are both bunches of interneurons, okay? If you're a nucleus, it's because you're inside the brain or the spinal cord. If you're a ganglion, it's because you're outside the brain or the spinal cord. The two terms differ on basically spatial location. If you could take a ganglion and move it inside, take a ganglion and move it inside a brain or a spinal cord, it'd become a nucleus. Don't blame me, blame the neuroanatomists. Okay, they're the guys who named these things. Okay, but that's basically it. Okay, and I only say this because in your reading you'll see structures referred to as such and such a ganglion, the basal ganglion, for example, or some sort of nucleus. And I just want you to know that that's a structure composed of interneurons and have some rough idea of where it is. Okay, that's all. So basically building some vocabulary here. And we're going to do some more of that when we move to the next level of this hierarchical organization and describe the major divisions of the nervous system. We speak of the nervous system, but in fact there are a bunch of different nervous systems depending on their location and depending on their function. We distinguish first between the central nervous system, which consists of the brain, the brainstem, and the spinal cord, all the things that are in the center of the body, right? And the peripheral nervous system, which is everything else that kind of connects to the brain or the brainstem or the spinal cord. And then everything else is called the peripheral nervous system because it's out here. It's in your legs, it's in your arms, in your hands and feet, and so on. And we divide the peripheral nervous system into two different divisions. First is the somatic nervous system, which basically connects all the nerves that run from the sensory receptors and to the skeletal musculature. All the afferent nerves that run from the sensory receptors in towards the central nervous system. The somatic nervous system also consists of all the efferent nerves that run out from the central nervous system to the skeletal musculature. And then we've got the autonomic nervous system, which basically consists of nerves that run to and from the internal organs. The lungs, the heart, the spleen, the liver, all that stuff is known as the autonomic nervous system. Okay? Major division, central versus peripheral. Okay? Within the central nervous system, we distinguish between the brain, the brainstem, and the spinal cord. I'm going to talk about the spinal cord today. We'll talk about the rest of it next time. The peripheral system, we distinguish between the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. Okay? Major divisions. Now we've basically finished our anatomy. Let's look at how some of these things work, what their functions are. And let's begin with the autonomic nervous system, which, just to carry through the theme of hierarchical organization, can itself be broken down into two components, what we call the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. Two divisions of the, two branches, if you will, of the autonomic nervous system. The function of the sympathetic nervous system is to organize the body to meet emergencies. Whenever something unexpected, something stressful, anything like that happens to an organism, it starts to deal with it, and it starts to deal with it by virtue of activation of the sympathetic the nervous system. And the way organisms have of meeting emergencies or responding to stressful events, basically four ways. Two are the classic ways of flight or fight. It's the sympathetic nervous system that organizes the flight or fight response to stresses. So you either want to get away from the stress or you turn and challenge the stressor somehow. If you're walking across campus and all of a sudden a gorilla leaps at you from behind some bush, your sympathetic nervous system moves into action very quickly to either get you out of there, away from the gorilla, or to prepare you to meet the gorilla head-on and see how that goes. Now, flight or fight is the classic way in which we have thought about how organisms respond to emergencies and stressful events. More recently, we've discovered two other ways in which organisms that meet emergencies, and they're known as tend and befriend. Okay, flight or fight, tend or befriend. There's something of the poet in these psychologists. By tend, what we mean is sometimes organisms will respond to emergencies by looking after the young, or looking after the injured, or whatever. They don't flee, they don't fight, they tend other organisms in the group, or they will meet the emergencies by befriending, by helping some other organism that's in the group that's separated by these, that's confronted by these stressors. Okay? But in any event, whether it's flight or fight or tend and befriend, all of that is done by the sympathetic nervous system, which basically does two things. The first thing that the sympathetic nervous system does is to secrete a hormone known as adrenaline that leads to emotional arousal. So it releases adrenaline into the bloodstream, and that produces a state of emotional arousal. Whether you're fleeing or fighting, tending or befriending, you are emotionally aroused when some kind of stressor occurs to you, when that gorilla pops out from behind the bushes or whatever. And that is done basically through the release of adrenaline. The sympathetic nervous system also releases another hormone known as noradrenaline, which essentially releases sugar into the bloodstream. Okay? And that gives you an energy boost. It's kind of like eating a Snickers bar or something like that. So it releases stored sugar so that the muscles in the body can function better than they ordinarily would. Okay, so the sympathetic nervous system leads to emotional arousal, the release of sugar into the stored sugar into the bloodstream, and the other thing that the sympathetic nervous system does is to rechannel the flow of blood from the surface of the body towards the muscles. Okay, basically moves the blood from one part of the body to another, and as you can imagine, this has at least two the adaptive functions. First, you want to get that stored sugar to the muscles so you can use them to meet emergencies. Okay, so the rechanneling of blood flow gets that sugar to the muscles faster. The other thing that happens is if that gorilla should like bite you or something, you don't want to bleed too much. Okay, so you get that blood away from the surface of the skin so as to minimize bleeding. All of this is done by the sympathetic nervous system in the process of helping the organism to meet emergencies. Yes? they're created pretty much simultaneously. Okay, I'm not an endocrinologist. Okay, so I'm prepared to stand corrected on this. But all of this happens over a period of moments. Okay, if I should arrange for one of the GSIs to come down during the next part of my lecture and say "boo" behind your back, you would become emotionally aroused. That blood sugar would go right to your muscles, and all that kind of pretty fast. Okay, so it happens fast enough. Another question? Well, it doesn't increase or decrease the speed of the reaction. What happens is, by closing off or dampening some channels of blood flow, it just gets more sugar where it's needed to the muscles over a relatively short period of time. Okay, that's all it does. Okay. All right, so that's what the sympathetic nervous system does, and it's doing all sorts of interesting things. But what about the parasympathetic nervous system? Well, the parasympathetic nervous system has a somewhat more mundane function of mediating what we know as the vegetative functions. It's the parasympathetic nervous system that mediates things like digestion, elimination of waste material. It's involved in reproductive functions and all of that kind of stuff. So under ordinary circumstances, the sympathetic nervous system helps the body meet emergencies. The parasympathetic nervous system basically maintains the body in a steady state. However, it turns out that both branches of the autonomic nervous system are involved in the organism's reactions to stress. And it turns out that the sympathetic and the parasympathetic branches of the autonomic nervous system are in a kind of antagonistic relationship to each other. As you might imagine, by which we mean that each of them tends to counteract the activity of the other. Each of them tends to modulate or dampen or counteract the activity of the other. So that, for example, as you might imagine, when your sympathetic nervous system is aroused, you're using up all that adrenaline and noradrenaline and all that kind of stuff. You're beginning to deplete bodily resources in various ways. And what happens is the parasympathetic nervous system kicks in pretty fast, not immediately, but pretty fast, to begin to restore resources that are being depleted by the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. Now, there are some other differences in how the sympathetic and parasympathetic branches operate, and they're kind of interesting. The first of these is that the sympathetic branch, the one that mediates flight and fight, tend and befriend, tends to act as a unit. When it gets energized, all of it gets energized at once. Everything is put into motion to help the organism meet emergencies. And this sympathetic activation has both a rapid onset, that is, it happens very quickly after the stressor occurs, and it has a relatively rapid offset, which means that as soon as the stressor is over, as soon as you've gotten away from the gorilla or the gorilla's looked at you and become afraid and gone back behind the bush or whatever it is it's going to do, the sympathetic nervous system turns itself off pretty quickly. But in any event, while it's on, the sympathetic nervous system is depleting resources at a fairly rapid rate. So what happens is, very quickly after the arousal of the sympathetic nervous system, the parasympathetic nervous system kicks in to begin to tone things down a little bit. And the parasympathetic nervous system acts very discreetly on various internal organs depending on where it is needed at the time. It monitors the conditions of all these internal organs and works to counteract sympathetic activity in a very discreet fashion depending on where it's needed. Now, interestingly, the parasympathetic nervous system has a relatively slow onset. It doesn't kick in as soon as the gorilla appears. It waits for a while, not hours and days. It waits for a little while until it's needed, and then it slowly begins to come on. And then when the stressor's over, it takes some time. It has a relatively slow offset function as well. So that what happens is when somebody first surprises you, you feel a real shock of emotional arousal. That's created by the autonomic nervous system. But you don't stay at that high level of autonomic arousal the entire time. You begin to lose some of your emotional arousal pretty quickly. That's because the parasympathetic nervous system is kicking in to tone things down. And then when the stressor is over, whatever it is that's been happening to you, you don't just go right back to zero, okay? You can actually have a kind of crash, if you will, go into an opposite hedonic state and take a while to recover your function. That's because the parasympathetic nervous system comes on slowly, tones down emotional arousal, and then goes away slowly. The toning down process takes some time to end. Notice that the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems act in opposite ways on each of these organs and tissues. When the sympathetic nervous system is activated, your pupil dilates. When you're afraid, your pupils dilate. The parasympathetic nervous system constricts the pupil. When the sympathetic nervous system is active, you're emotionally aroused, you tend not to tear too much, you get a dry mouth, you're not salivating. When this parasympathetic nervous system that kicks in, you get secretion from the tear glands, you get salivation, you get all of this kind of stuff. So the sympathetic and the parasympathetic branches are operating together to help the organism meet emergencies, but they are organized so that each one tends to counteract the activity of the other. And it's the combined operation of the parasympathetic and sympathetic branches that lead you to have the emotional state that you're experiencing whenever you're meeting a stressor. And here's a point where I have to say that when psychologists talk about stressors, they don't just mean negative things. Psychology defines a stressor as any unexpected event. Okay? So it could be a surprise birthday party. It could be a gorilla jumping out from behind the bushes. It could be almost anything. Anything that challenges the current state of the organism, an unexpected event that challenges the current state of the organism, is what we define as a stressor. And your response to these stressors, whether it's positive or negative, pleasant, unpleasant, flight, fight, tend, befriend, all of that is mediated by the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system acting together. Okay, you want a mnemonic for trying to distinguish between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems. Sympathetic, think of it as sympathy is a feeling. Sympathetic nervous system mediates emotional arousal. Parasympathetic, think about paramedics, people who rescue you, people who try to help you get better. Okay, the parasympathetic nervous system tends to restore functions that are restore resources that are being depleted by the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, that's all I want to say for now about the autonomic nervous system. Can take a moment for questions or clarifications about this if you want. Yeah. Fainting is not something I'm an expert on. Okay, so I can't. I've done it, right? But I can't tell you exactly how that happens. I suspect that. Well, yeah. I mean, whatever it is you do in response to a stressor is going to happen by virtue of some combination of sympathetic and parasympathetic activity. You might think. I mean, it's an interesting hypothesis. We can check this. What happens when you faint typically is that you're losing blood from the brain, I think, is the basic physiological mechanism of fainting, which is why when somebody faints, you don't really want to raise their head, right? It just kind of makes it worse. That sounds like a parasympathetic action to me. Certainly fainting doesn't fit into either flight or fight or tend or befriend. It's kind of, one of those things that doesn't really help people to meet these stressors. I don't know. I'll check on that if I can. If anybody here is an expert in the physiology of fainting, post something to the course website and we'll get an answer for you. One more question, then I got to go on. Yes? Yeah, emotional arousal. Yeah, by emotional arousal, what I meant was the physiological component of emotional arousal, okay? The particular emotion that you feel probably comes from someplace else. That's a very complicated issue, and it's not what I want to talk about today, though I will talk about it, okay? Good question. What we're talking about, this is a purely physiological process that we're talking about right now. It just happens to be that physiological arousal is one of those things that underlies your emotional state, okay? All right, so that's the autonomic nervous system and how it functions to both maintain bodily states and organize the body's the organism's reactions to stress. Moving right along to the somatic nervous system, again, like the autonomic nervous system, the somatic nervous system can be divided into a couple of different branches. The first of these is what are known as the spinal nerves, of which there are 31, which are called the spinal nerves because they emanate from the spinal cord. And you can see them here. There's a couple coming out of the spinal cord going down the arms, a bunch in the main torso, a bunch coming out of the spinal cord and going down the legs and the feet. Those are the spinal nerves, and there are 31 of them. And except for that one, they're organized into pairs, left and right. And then we have 12 cranial nerves, which emanate from various parts of the brain and the brainstem. Okay? So again, it's all nice hierarchically organized package. The somatic nervous system you can break down into these spinal nerves and these cranial nerves. Now, we don't ask you to memorize all 31 spinal nerves and all 12 cranial nerves or all of that, but I do want you to have some sense of how these nerves function because, frankly, it's kind of interesting. First, the cranial nerves turn out to be highly specialized. Each cranial nerve is dedicated to a very small number of particular functions. Some cranial nerves are exclusively afferent in nature, which means that their sole job is to mediate impulses coming into the brain from the sense organs. Other cranial nerves are exclusively efferent in nature. Their sole function is to mediate motor impulses coming out of the brain, going towards various parts of the skeletal musculature. And of course, just to make life a little bit difficult, there are some cranial nerves that are mixed in nature. They have both afferent and efferent functions. So, for example, let's look at a couple of exclusively afferent nerves. The olfactory nerve, okay, known as cranial nerve number 1, and that mediates the sense of smell. Basically, it's the olfactory nerve that connects your nose and the sensory structures in the nose to the brain, and all it does is to take olfactory impulses, olfactory messages from the nose to the brain. Similarly, the optic nerve, known as cranial nerve number 2, is exclusively for vision. The optic nerve connects the eyes to the brain and basically takes visual signals from the retina, carries them to the brain. Here are two exclusively efferent cranial nerves. The oculomotor nerve, known as cranial nerve number 3, it has the sole function of moving the eyes, left, right, up, down, whatever it is you can do with your eyes. You do that by virtue of the oculomotor nerve, which, as its name implies, moves the eyes. And that's all it does. Okay? It's a lot, but that's all it does. And then finally, we have the hypoglossal nerve, cranial nerve 12, whose sole function is to move the tongue. When you speak, when you eat, when you kiss, whatever it is that you do with your tongue, you do it by virtue of the hypoglossal nerve. Then we have a couple of examples of mixed nerves. The trigeminal nerve, cranial nerve 5, is involved both with the sense of touch around the face, and that's its efferent function. That's its afferent function, its sensory function. Its motor function, its efferent function, has to do with chewing. So the trigeminal nerve runs down here and mediates a lot of all of that. I'm losing my little thing here. I'll put back on. And then finally, we have the facial nerve, cranial nerve 7. Its afferent function, its sensory function, is to mediate the sense of taste. Basically, it connects the taste buds and other gustatory receptors on the tongue to the brain, but also the facial nerve is involved on the motor side in moving the face. When you smile, when you frown, when you do all those other good things with your face, you're using the facial nerve to do it. So again, you've got these highly specialized cranial nerves, some of which are exclusively afferent, sensory in nature, some of which are exclusively efferent or motor in nature, and others of which, just to kind of keep you awake, are mixed. They combine both afferent and efferent functions. That's in contrast to the spinal nerves, all of which combine afferent and efferent functions. The spinal nerves carry sensory messages in toward the spinal cord from the surface of the skin and other places, like touch. And they also carry motor messages out from the spinal cord to the arms and legs and hands and fingers and toes and anything else that you want to move. That's because each spinal nerve, here's a little diagram, this is a spinal cord. Each spinal nerve contains two branches, okay? There is an afferent branch, which takes sensory signals in to the spinal cord, and there's an efferent branch, which takes motor signals and sends them out from the spinal cord. So all the spinal nerves combine afferent and efferent functions because there's an afferent branch and an efferent branch. And you can see that. This is pretty much what it looks like on the spinal cord right here. Now, the other thing you have to see is the distribution. Notice the distribution of the spinal nerves, okay, which has two important properties. The first is that there is a regular distribution between the location of the spinal nerve and the part of the body that it serves. Up here in the cervical division of the spinal cord, we have a bunch of spinal nerves that run to the arms and the hands. Then in the thoracic division, we've got a bunch of spinal nerves that run to the torso and the body cavity. In the lumbar and sacral division, we have a bunch of spinal nerves that run to the legs and the feet and the lower parts of the body and all that. You can see that here. So it's not that there's a spinal nerve that comes out here that has to be kind of wound up the spinal cord and out the arm or anything like that. There's a regular association between the part of the body that the nerve is serving and where it connects to the spinal cord. The other thing you should notice is that there is a kind of proportional representation, if you will, between the number of spinal nerves that project to a particular part of the body and the needs of that particular body part for fine sensory acuity and fine motor control. You want to have a lot of sensitivity in your hands. You want to have a lot of dexterity in your hands. Hands are a pretty small part of your body. There's a lot of spinal nerves running to them. Same thing for your feet. A lot of spinal nerves running to a relatively small part of your feet, not because your feet are, it can't be because your feet are big, because they're not. It's because you need a lot of delicate control over your feet, and you want a lot of sensitivity in your feet. given the size of the body area that's involved here, relatively few spinal nerves run to the midsection of the body, the torso and the internal parts of the trunk of the body, all of that. Okay, so there's a regular association and there's a proportional representation. Two important facts about the distribution of these spinal nerves. Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit more about spinal nerves in a second, but let's stop for a moment and see if anybody has any questions about any of this. This should all be pretty straightforward. Okay, let's finish up by going to the spinal cord itself. And what the spinal cord basically does is to conduct neural impulses between the periphery of the body and the brain and the brainstem. Motor messages coming out of the brain and the brainstem go down the spinal cord, out the efferent branch of the spinal nerves. Sensory messages coming from various parts of the body go in to the spinal cord through the afferent branch of the spinal nerves and then go up to the brain. What you can see here in red, this is a slice of the spinal cord. Here are what are known as the ascending tracts. They're carrying sensory messages up to the brain. Here are some descending tracts. They carry motor messages down from the brain so they can get out to the periphery. Then there are some association tracts that actually connect sensory and motor functions right at the level of the neuron. We'll talk about that in a second. And then of course, there are always some mixed tracts. But the point is that the afferent branch connects to the ascending tract, which moves the impulses to the brain. The descending tract connects to the efferent branch, which allows you to move various parts of the body. Now let's look at some of the implications of this for what happens if there should occur a break in the spinal cord. If by virtue of an accident, for example, someone suffers a break in the spinal cord such that the nerves are severed. What happens under those circumstances is that you get a neurological condition that is known as paraplegia, which involves a loss of both sensory function and voluntary movement. Okay, loss of sensation and voluntary movement, but not for all parts of the body, just for those parts of the body that are served by spinal nerves located below the site of the damage. Okay, so if your spinal cord happens to be cut about here, your arms and hands will still work fine, but you'll lose sensory and voluntary motor functions in your legs and your feet. If the cut in the spinal cord is very high, if it's up here, you get a special case of paraplegia known as quadriplegia, a complete loss of function in all four limbs, both arms and both legs. Even if the spinal cord is cut very high, broken very high up here, you do not die, okay? And that's because vital functions are maintained by one of those cranial nerves known as the vagus nerve, which keeps the internal organs going. You can see the vagus nerve right there running down from the brainstem. Okay, it's not one of the spinal nerves, and that maintains various vital functions. However, in paraplegia, what you lose is voluntary motor function, the ability to initiate some motor response at the level of the brain to say, I want to move my hand, and then have that hand move. Even in cases of paraplegia and quadriplegia, some motor functions remain intact. These are known as the spinal reflexes. These spinal reflexes are mediated at the level of the spinal cord. They don't need any involvement of the brain or the brainstem. The connections that are needed to the reflex arc, if you will, is performed exactly at the level of the spinal cord. If we go back to this earlier branch, here we have these ascending tracts. the afferent branch of the spinal nerve is coming in here, okay? Then you've got the efferent branch coming in here, and you've got these interneurons, which will actually connect them and permit the spinal reflex to occur. So what you lose in paraplegia is sensation first. Why? Because whatever is going on at the level of the spinal cord is not getting up to the brain. So you don't have any conscious sensation. You lose voluntary motor function. Why? Because whatever it is that you want to do that's being organized by the brain can't get down to the level of the spinal cord that is performing that kind of activity. However, those spinal reflexes that are mediated solely at the level of the spinal cord remain intact, so that, for example, the patellar reflex, when your doctor taps your patellar tendon and you do this, that kind of thing will remain intact. The reflexes involved in elimination of waste, penile erection, ejaculation, all of those things are reflexes that are mediated solely at the level of the spinal cord. So these spinal reflexes will remain intact despite a cut in the brain stem. Okay, that's basically what happens here. Two interesting aspects to these spinal reflexes, three actually. The first is they are exaggerated. If you test the patellar reflex in a person with a break in the spinal cord who's paraplegic, say from the waist down, that spinal reflex will be exaggerated compared to somebody who is neurologically intact. That is because the brain is constantly sending signals down the spinal cord that modulate, dampen, diminish the strength of the spinal reflex. When the spinal cord is broken, those modulating impulses can't get down there anymore, so you get an exaggerated reflex. Second property is that these reflexes are unconscious. Why? Because the mediation is completely at the level of the spinal cord, and there's no feedback to the brain, which is the seat of consciousness. And then finally, these spinal reflexes are completely involuntary, even though your patellar tendon is still working. There's nothing you can do to prevent it from working. There's nothing you can do to use those same muscles to initiate any kind of motor response. Okay, so that is the peripheral part. I got 3 minutes. We're not done. That's the peripheral part of the nervous system. The organization of the nervous system hierarchically into neurons and tissues and nerves and all that stuff. The distinction between the central and the peripheral nervous system. Within the peripheral nervous system, the distinction between the somatic and the autonomic nervous system. Within the autonomic nervous system, sympathetic and parasympathetic. Within the somatic nervous system, cranial nerves, spinal nerves, afferent functions, efferent functions. Next time, we'll turn our attention to the big guy, to the brain itself. Thank you very much. Have a good holiday.